All right, welcome back, everyone. If you'll indulge me a little bit, I'd like to talk about comics today. So here we have the cover of Action Comics #1 from 1938. There were comic books before this. There were comics well before comic books. But this is the introduction of the superhero here. And this comic book form is what I'd like to talk about. Now, we've been looking at a lot of paintings as a way of understanding and studying design and how visual communication operates. Comic books are generally not thought of as a medium that carries quite as much weight as painting. There's a long, long history involved with painting as a means of communication. Comic books are a relatively new invention, and there is a lot of not very good stuff out there in terms of comic books. But there are some other things that are rather interesting, especially for our purposes in studying design, and I'd like to look at that. But first, we should acknowledge that comic books and comics aren't the first form of sequential art. So here is the Arena Chapel in Padua, Italy, and it is filled along the walls and at the back of the chapel with paintings by Giotto. These are paintings from the 1300s, and all along the sides, they show the lives of Mary and Christ. So these are images here that create a sequential story when looked at in order. And at the back of the chapel, you can see as well that there is the Last Judgment here. So the final story in Christendom there. So sequential art is a very old thing. Giotto certainly didn't invent it either. We can look back thousands of years at the height of the Egyptian kingdom and see a lot of sequential stories told through art on their wall paintings and drawings. So it's a very old thing, this idea of sequential art, but comic books have taken them into an area that's more readily available to the public because it's printed in mass quantities. So we could talk about also some artists here like Sigmar Polke who use the language of comic books as well. So here's Spider-Man from 1971 and 74, or pop artists like Roy Lichtenstein here who directly take imagery from comic books and comic strips to make larger scale paintings. Or someone like Raymond Pettibon, who is a contemporary artist who uses the language of the comic book for their own ends. But that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about comic books proper. So let's come forward a little bit in time from the 1300s in Giotto to the 1900s. Little Nemo in Slumberland is a one-page comic strip that ran from 1905 to 1911, and they're all about this little boy Nemo and his dreams, and all of them end in the final panel with him waking up. But here's a good example of the utility of repeated imagery in sequential art to tell a narrative. So starting in the third row of panels there, we see that Nemo is on a horse, this pony, and he rides it for 5 more panels of the comic strip in relatively the same location in each panel. But what's changing is the environment around him. So the use of repeated imagery across panels can help to tell a narrative story here. You'll also notice on the bottom strip of panels that we might look at this strip as an example of a modulation in position of our shape, this human shape that is turning over itself to land on the floor by his bed there. Here's another example of Little Nemo. And you'll see that the artist, Winsor McCay, is very interested in the use of the layout of panels as a storytelling device in itself, as a means of design here. So we have all these rectilinear panel shapes, and in the center is that big circle with the turkey inside it, and the moon you can see as well, a repetition of that circle again. So using contrast of panel shapes here to aid in the design of the page, of the story. But let's come forward to more contemporary and recent works. You might be familiar with this comic book if you're into comic books, that sort of thing. Watchmen is a pretty big deal. HBO recently had a series based on this comic book. Well, it's actually based a little bit after the events of this comic book, but inspired by this world. It's very good, also because the music is by Trent Reznor, so you should enjoy that. But Watchmen is a comic book that was created by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. And here's the cover of the first issue here. Now, what I'm going to try to do is, when available, I'm going to be looking at pages from these comic books with the color removed, because we're not using color in this class yet. There's some instances where I'll bring the color back, or I didn't have access to black and white images. But in this case, you'll see the images in black and white. You can buy Watchmen as Watchmen Noir, which is in black and white, or you can look at the original Watchmen, which is in full color. But again, I'm showing you these images in black and white to help remove a little bit of that distraction that the color causes, and looking at this in just a linear shape and tone world here. So here's the cover of the first issue, and you can see here in the first page of this issue that the image of the smiley face button is repeated, and we're zooming out and we can see that it's next to a storm drain. We're zooming out and we can see the sidewalk all the way up to the final panel of the page that shows a man looking out of a broken window of a skyscraper. Here is the use of repeated imagery, getting smaller and smaller, to move us in space through the panels of the comic book. Now, Watchmen is set up on a 3-panel by 3-panel grid that's going to repeat pretty consistently throughout the entire comic, and it's going to shift and break that rule later on. But most of the comic plays out in this 3-panel by 3-panel grid. And this is very important. It sets up an expectation for the comic. It also slows down our engagement with each panel, because you have to pay attention to what's happening in each small panel on the page before moving on, instead of having larger splash pages with illustration covering up the entire page. And we'll see what I'm talking about. I do want to make a note of the use of color in Watchmen, though. So if we look at this image of it, which is from the original release of the comic, the color that is used throughout the series is largely a combination of purples, oranges, and greens. And this is significant. It's important for a reason here. So let's take a look back at that Action Comics cover, and you'll see a preponderance of red, blue, and yellow, the primary colors. There is the big green car, which is, of course, a combination of blue and yellow. But most of the colors on the page are red, blue, and yellow, the primary colors. And this is for the benefit of the printing process. These colors were used very heavily, especially in early comic books, to both create a sense of balance visually, because when you have the three primary colors represented in a strong stated way, it helps to create a sense of balance. But also, again, because there's a limited number of colors that the publishers had access to print these comic books with. So their palette is limited. These are, what I'm talking about here are delimitations, right? Constraints set up by the medium itself that the artists have to work within these constraints to create the best product that they can. Here's a page from a more contemporary Superman comic. This is All-Star Superman, written by Grant Morrison and art by Frank Quitely and Jamie Grant. That demonstrates, again, this use of red, blue, and yellow to balance the colors out across the image. This idea is very old. So if we look back in the 1500s here, this painting by El Greco, Madonna and Child with St. Martina and St. Agnes here. You'll again see the heavy use of red, blue, and yellow as a means to balance the image across the picture plane. And again, we're not getting into color yet in this class, but I just want to stop and mention this idea of red, blue, and yellow as being the usual means of balancing an image in comic books, at least. So it's significant here that Watchmen is using a preponderance of purples, oranges, and greens. These are the secondary colors. So if the primary triad is red, blue, and yellow, the secondary triad is purple, orange, and green. And the use of these colors keys the reader into the fact that this world that is being created in Watchmen is slightly skewed. It's a little off. Now, this is about context. Within the context of comic books writ large, again, this balance through the use of the primary triad of red, blue, and yellow is what readers of comics are used to seeing. So within this context, to see this secondary triad take over helps to push through design this idea of the world being a little different, slightly off from the one that we're used to seeing. So back to the black and white for now. And again, I want to make note of this repetition of the 3x3 panel grid. Now, throughout the comic, there might be instances where the design of the page is slightly changed, right? In the very first page, we see that the bottom row of 3 panels is combined into 1 panel. On this other page to the right here, you can see that the left and middle columns of panels are combined into a larger image. And even though there are several instances of this throughout the book, this 3x3 or 9-panel grid is consistent throughout. So here's the last page of the penultimate issue of the series. And you can see that they're doing something different here. Each panel in the top 2 rows has been divided in half, so that now there are 6 panels moving across the top and middle row. This creates a shortening of time so that things are starting to happen in rapid fire succession. And you'll also notice this really beautiful modulation in the second row here going across. What's happening here in this image is there's an explosion that's happening in the middle of New York. So you can see these characters in the middle row slowly disintegrating until we get to the bottom row of just a blank panel. So that here, the absence of any drawing is the drawing. The absence of any material is the design itself. So the effective use of negative space here. So this is the penultimate issue, and now we come to the ultimate issue, and I'm going to bring the color back again to show the way that it's being used here. So chapter 12 is the final issue of the series, and if you don't want any spoilers or anything, you know, look away for a little while. But here's how it opens, and we get the first page, and you can see, again, this repetition from cover of the clock here covered in blood to zooming out a little bit And you'll notice here that all of a sudden we've come to a full page spread, that we're not using the 3x3 grid anymore. It's no longer 9 panels. It is a single panel for the entire page. The book up until this point has not done this at all. And so there's a big effect that it has on you as a reader, because you're used to the cramped spaces of the 9-panel grid here. When we come to something so large, this is really horrifying. It helps to push the narrative forward. But you will notice that although there are not 9 panels here, that the image is still divided into thirds, a top, middle, and bottom section of the image. And this goes on for the next few pages. So here's the next spread, and showing destruction and everything. Very gruesome. The next spread of pages, continuing with all this destruction and chaos and gore. And we come to the title page here on the left, which shows this monster that has appeared in New York City. And from there, the comic slowly moves back into its 3x3 grid. We can see the next page goes to 3 panels across the page, and we'll get into the 9-panel grid as we move forward again. So what this comic is doing is it's setting up an expectation and then deviating on that expectation. That is a unity and a contrast. That is communication through design. So let's move on to another comic book, Batman. I don't want to spend too much time on this one, but I do want to look at this in terms of expectations that the reader has, and how the design of the book is challenging those expectations. So just narratively at this point, Batman is caught in a maze by this super bad group called the Court of Owls, and he is losing his mind. His world is being turned upside down. And to show that, literally, the pages then switch so that you have to turn your book sideways in order to read it. And this will go on for a couple of more pages. You can see where everything is sideways, and then the book goes upside down. And to continue reading it, you have to turn the book upside down so that your relationship to the media itself is changing. So this is a bit of a sort of metatextual design element here, that you can only continue engaging through this by physically altering your relationship to the book. Now, are you turning the book, or is the book turning you around in this instance? There is really no such thing as a fixed position in the universe. Everything is moving constantly away from each other. So do you, as the reader, represent the fixed position and the book is changing, or are you moving around the book to fit its requirements of you? And you can see that this upside down continues for the next couple of pages until Batman gets stabbed. I know there's a lot of gore in this. It's comic books. It's kind of what's going on here. So let's move on from there. Another Batman, The Long Halloween. Tim Sale is an excellent artist and designer, and I want to look at these pages, the use of the repetition of imagery here to tell, again, this sequential story. So faucet on, turning the faucet off, getting into the bath, and being shot as we move into the next page here. Now, Sale is excellent at keeping his drawings graphic. They create space and flatten themselves out on the picture plane at the same time. This is a tension, a push and pull into and out of the picture plane that is created by the heavy use of stark contrast. Again, what we're looking at here is Batman Noir, The Long Halloween. So it's an edition of the book where they've completely removed the color. Again, I'm looking at this for your benefit because this is how we're working in this class. We haven't started using color yet. But Sale is making use of these big, bold shapes that move across the entire picture plane, and the blocking of and reinforcement of those shapes through the use of light and dark tonality. There's another image here. Good use of contrast of geometric and organic shapes. Batman in front of these blinds with the light coming in. And Sale is also really excellent at his use of negative space, this large expanse in the entire bottom half of the image of the just black ink with the one word balloon there, right, which creates a good contrast. There's good balance between the top and bottom halves because of the isolation of this word balloon bubble in the bottom half, right, creates a heavy weight around that area, whereas the dispersal of the large expansion of imagery across the top half is able to balance those two halves of the image out. Here's a really great example of a sort of dense to sparse composition with the Scarecrow here riding horseback. And Sale is also really good at the use of implied lines, or really what's happening here is the artist is allowing our imagination to complete the image. You don't have to show the entire full edge, right? Perceptually on the page, there can exist shapes which are not fully delineated by the artist. So these shapes exist as implied lines that we continue in our own mind to complete the shape of an object, which doesn't have to be directly shown to you. It can be suggested through the placement here of blocks of light and dark. Here's another really great example of that idea as well. How much can you get away with not showing the viewer and still have the full impact of the image come across? We can still fully read what's happening in this image without being shown everything. And again, I want to note this great contrast between geometric and organic shapes and the excellent use of negative space moving into and out of the positive forms on the image. And that's really all I want to talk about. Just a few examples of this stuff. We look at a lot of paintings. That's what I know. It's what I do. And so it's easy for me to teach these ideas through painting. Painting is not the only visual media that uses these design ideas that I'm talking about. Any sort of design is going to be governed by the same ideas of the ways that perceptual forces work on our psyche. That can be true if you're designing an ad for a magazine, if you're designing a book layout, if you're doing comic books. Any sort of visual language is going to be subject to the same principles of design. I read a lot of comic books, so I wanted to just look at a different sort of medium here for a second. And also, as we're getting into this idea of reinforcement with light and dark, comic books provide a pretty accessible way of looking at the way that light and dark can reinforce and help make an image more dynamic. I've looked at a pretty limited range of comic books here, 2 Batman comic books, some Superman, Watchmen. These are pretty mainstream things. There's an entire wealth of underground comics and other sorts of things that you should look into if you're interested in this sort of thing. A couple of other mentions, off the top of my head, we can look at Sandman, which was a long-running series in the 80s and 90s. Most recently, there was an extra volume released called Sandman Overture. Neil Gaiman is an excellent storyteller, and J.H. Williams III is a really unbelievable artist. Throughout the entire run of Sandman, various artists have worked on the comic, and they've all been really amazing. In particular, the covers by Dave McKean are really fabulous. So you should check those out. Here's a couple of pages from Sandman Overture, looking at the way that the artist is using design. So here is the first and last page of one of the issues in this volume. So you can see the shape and the design layout of the panels on the page are repeated in inverse from the first page on the left to the last page on the right. Here's a spread from another issue in the series, which shows really great contrast of organic and geometric shapes. Very geometric on the right side, very organic on the left side, but you'll notice that in the left side, where one of the characters is using these sort of tarot cards, that the cards create a sort of soft geometry within a very organic world. And then over on the right side, there are these organic human shapes that exist within these very geometric panels. So this yin-yang idea, right? A way of creating balance across the spread of pages here. Just another comic book you might want to look at, Akira by Katsuhiro Otomo, is great, excellent stuff. You know, Japan has a huge wealth of manga, and a lot of it is decidedly not great in terms of design. Akira, on the other hand, is excellent. It's really, really good stuff. There was a movie released, I think like in the late 80s. It's weird. It doesn't tell the whole story of the comic, so it just kind of ends without things being explained or anything. The comic series, or the manga, I guess I should say, is nuts. It's insane. You should check it out. It's really good stuff. Here's an image from one of the issues. All right, so homework. Quite a bit of it. Read Art and Visual Perception by Rudolf Arnheim, the chapter on light. So this is where we're going. We are starting to transition to prepare you a little bit for Design 2, in which you'll be looking at tone and color. So the light chapter is where we need to begin with that, especially since we're starting to use the reinforcement of light and dark in our designs. Studio problem number 24, using narrow dark lines in a root 2 format, create a contrast of shape, geometric to organic. Reinforce it with light dark. Give me 5 thumbnails and 5 variations. I also want you to do studio problem number 25. Create 3 values as 4 using black, white, and mid-gray. And studio problem number 26. Create 3 values as 4 using off-black, off-white, and mid-gray. And I'll show you just what I mean by that. This is the design. On the left, you'll have a black square, and on the right, you'll have a white square. Within these 2 squares, place a smaller square. Both of these squares should be the same middle gray value, the exact same. And so here's how this works. Within the light world, the middle gray square appears to be darker than it actually is. And within the dark world, the middle gray square appears to be lighter than it actually is. So that these 2 middle gray squares, because of their location within a context, appear to be different values, lighter on the left and darker on the right, because of what they're surrounded by. So you've used 3 tones, black, white, and an absolute middle gray. And you've made them appear to be 4 different tones. So this works pretty well, but you'll see that when you do problem 26, that it works even better. If I use off black and an off white, so a very dark charcoal gray and a very light gray for my 2 large squares, and I place that exact same middle gray in the center of these two squares. Just like that. I'm showing you the bar across there to show that these values are the same. But what I want you to do is to place them just as you see them now, two smaller squares within larger squares. You'll notice when you do this yourself that when you use an off black, this dark charcoal gray, and a very light gray instead of absolute black and absolute white, you'll notice that it is more effective in making the gray square on the right look darker and the gray square on the left look lighter. Now, this is because when you use absolute black and absolute white, the tonality of the image gets blown out. It's too extreme. But when you limit it just a little bit, right? Again, we talked about how those comic artists had limitations that they were working within that helped them be creative, right? In the way that they used color, in the way that they're using panels. This is the same thing. It's a delimitation. So you're not using the full range of colors anymore. When that range of tone from light to dark gets diminished just a little bit, gets squeezed in just a little bit, then the tones have a better chance of interacting in a relational way, of interacting in a plastic isomorphic way, which is what we need to understand as we start to move into tone, and especially when we move towards color and design too. So these are the two designs for 25 and 26 that I want you to create. You can get these colors, you can get these tones by doing this very easily on your computer, or you can use the packet of color aid paper that you should have gotten that was listed in your required materials in the syllabus to do this. I do not suggest doing this with pen and pencil or paint or anything like that. You're not going to get the correct outcome if you try to create these colors yourself. What you're doing when you use the color aid paper is you're using a resource that is already given to you, or if you do this on your computer, again, you can click directly in the center from light to dark using Microsoft Paint or any other sort of simple illustration app on your computer. These colors are already laid out for you, or these tones are already laid out for you, and so it's easier to access rather than trying to create it yourself. That's it. If you have any questions, send me an email.